Mr. President, there is a war going on in this country, and I'm not referring to the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan. I'm talking about a war being waged by some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in this country against the working families of the United States of America, against the disappearing and shrinking middle class of our country. The reality is that many of the nation's billionaires are on the warpath. They want more, more, more. Their greed has no end, and apparently there is very little concern for our country or for the people of this country if it gets in the way of the accumulation of more and more wealth and more power. Between 1980 and 2005, 80% of all new income created in this country went to the top 1%. 80% of all new income. The United States now has, by far, the most unequal distribution of income and wealth of any major country on earth. When we were in school, we used to read the textbooks which talked about the banana republics in Latin America. We used to read the books about countries in which a handful of people owned and controlled most of the wealth of those countries. Well, guess what? That's exactly what is happening in the United States today. So I am sure that in a little while my friends are going to come down to the floor and say, we're very concerned about the deficit, we're very concerned about the national debt, but you know what we're more concerned about? Giving huge tax breaks to the wealthiest people in this country. But, Mr. President, the tax issue is just one part of what some of our wealthy friends want to see happen in this country. The reality is that many of these folks want to bring the United States back to where we were in the 1920s. And they want to do their best to eliminate all traces of social legislation which working families fought tooth and nail to develop to bring a modicum of stability and security to their lives. There are people out there, not all, but there are some who want to privatize or completely eliminate Social Security. They want to privatize or cut back substantially on Medicare. Yeah, if you're 75 years of age and you have no money, good luck to you getting your health insurance at an affordable cost from a private insurance company. I am just sure there are all kinds of private insurance companies out there just delighted to take care of low-income seniors who are struggling with cancer or another disease. Mr. President, furthermore, there are corporate leaders out there and many members of Congress who not only want to continue, they want to expand our disastrous trade policies. My wife and I went shopping the other day, started our Christmas shopping. And we looked and virtually every product that was out there in the store, consumer products, was China, China, and China. We seem to be a country in which we have a 51st state named China, which is producing virtually all of the products that we as Americans consume. Our trade policy has resulted in the loss of millions of good-paying jobs as large corporations and CEOs have said, why do I want to reinvest in America when I can go to countries where people are paid 50 cents, 75 cents an hour? That's what I'm going to do, to heck with the working people of this country.
Contrary to what those in power would like you to believe, so that you'll give up your pension, cut your wages, and settle for the life your great-grandparents had, America is not broke. Not by a long shot. The country is awash in wealth and cash. It's just that it's not in your hand. It has been transferred in the greatest heist in history from the workers and consumers to the banks and the portfolios of the uber rich. And please, someone in the mainstream media, repeat this fact once. 400 little Mubaraks, most of whom benefited in some way from the multi-trillion-dollar taxpayer bailout of 2008, now have more cash, stock, and property than the assets of 155 million Americans combined. If you can't bring yourself to call that a financial coup d'etat, then you are simply not being honest with what you know in your heart to be true. Yes. But I can see why people don't want to even think about this. For us to admit that we have let a small group of men abscond with and hoard the bulk of the wealth that runs our economy would mean that we'd have to accept the humiliating acknowledgement that we have indeed surrendered our precious democracy to the moneyed elite. Wall Street, the banks, and the Fortune 500 now run this republic. But the few who have the most money don't want to pay their fair share of the taxes. They'd rather invest it in a gambling casino known as Wall Street, betting for or against the stock market or against your home mortgage. And the entire population suffers because that wealth has been removed from circulation. What's so cynical about this is that the very people who don't pay their taxes crashed our economic system. They created the unemployment, which has caused less tax revenue. And states like Wisconsin have ended up with a so-called budget crisis. As the economy and the stock market went into a tailspin, and the banks were caught conducting a worldwide Ponzi scheme, Wall Street issued this threat: either hand over trillions of dollars from the American taxpayers, or we will crash this economy straight into the ground.
Many of us were told in private conversations that if we voted against this bill on Monday, that the sky would fall, the market would drop 2,000 or 3,000 points the first day, another couple thousand the second day, and a few members were even told that there would be martial law in America if we voted no. That's what I call fear-mongering.
There's a word for that, isn't there? Terrorism. It's a form of terrorism, isn't it? Fork it over, or it's goodbye savings accounts. Fork it over, or it's goodbye pensions. Fork it over, or it's goodbye United States Treasury. Fork it over, or it's goodbye jobs and homes and future. Finally, America, again, isn't broke. The only thing that's broke is the moral compass of the rulers. And we aim to fix that compass and steer the ship ourselves from this point on.
Well, we're seeing these mass protests in Madison, Wisconsin, and there's other protests that are happening. We see the working poor, the middle class, under tremendous stress, and yet they're the ones who are being hit hardest, not Wall Street. Explain what has happened. Why isn't Wall Street in jail?
Well, it's an incredible story. I mean, just to back up, provide some context, I think, for this Wisconsin thing, and especially for the Ohio thing, given what their governor used to do for a living.
Explain.
Well, he was an employee for Lehman Brothers, and he was...
This is Governor Kasich.
Governor Kasich, yeah, and he was intimately involved with getting the state of Ohio's pension fund to invest in Lehman Brothers and buy mortgage-backed securities, and of course they lost all that money. And this broadly was really what the mortgage bubble and the financial crisis was all about. It was essentially a gigantic criminal fraud scheme where all the banks were taking mismarked mortgage-backed securities, very, very dangerous, toxic subprime loans, They were chopping them up and then packaging them as AAA rated investments and then selling them to state pension funds, to insurance companies, to Chinese banks and Dutch banks and Icelandic banks. And of course, these things were blowing up, and all those funds were going broke. But what they're doing now is they're blaming the people who are actually the victims of this fraud scheme. And the only reason that people aren't angrier about this, I think, is because they don't really understand what happened. If these were car companies that had sold $1 trillion worth of defective cars to the citizens of the United States, there'd be riots right now. But these were mortgage-backed securities. It's complicated. People don't understand it. And they're only now, I think, beginning to realize that they were defrauded.
Explain what the crime is, who has profited, who should be on trial.
Well, again, the broad crime in all of this was just fraud. These banks were taking, again, these subprime mortgages, and they would have these billion-dollar pools of mortgages where, in some cases, 70 or 80% of the loans were to people who had no identification or no jobs or who had put no money down into the mortgage. And then they were taking these loans and applying this phony baloney hocus-pocus math, these derivative instruments, and turning them into AAA-rated investments. And they were marketing, again, these securities to, say, state pension funds as AAA-rated investments, which means credit risk almost zero. So they took this stuff that they knew was very, very risky and very, very likely to default, and they were going to the state of Wisconsin, the state of Ohio, the state of New York, and saying, hey, this is almost as safe as, or in fact, it is as safe as the United States Treasury bonds. You should buy this, and you'll earn a little bit more than you'll earn if you buy T-bills. The reality was they were just taking absolutely worthless stuff and sticking it with these people, and then fleeing the scene. This is no different than drug dealers who take a bag of oregano and sell it to you as a pound of weed. That's exactly the same scam.
What did the 2008 crash mean?
Well, it was this was the collapse of a giant bubble scheme. When they did this, when they pumped the whole country full of these defective cars, which were these defective mortgages, it created a very, very dangerous situation for the entire country. They ended up essentially bankrupting or fatally wounding pension funds and insurance companies and banks all over the country. And so now we're all paying for those phony scams. But the other amazing thing that they did is, the banks, when they flooded the market with these phony securities, some of them were smart enough to realize that they were eventually going to blow. So they started betting against them. They went to companies like AIG, and they took out trillions of dollars of credit default swaps and pseudo insurance policies on these mortgages. When they all blew up, it blew up some of these companies like AIG, and that's what the bailout was really all about. The bailout wasn't really to pay off real losses in these mortgages. It was really to pay off the bets on these mortgages. So not only did they flood the market with $1 trillion of defective merchandise, they got the United States taxpayer to pony up $5, $6, $7 trillion worth of bailout money to pay off their bets on all this stuff.
Alan Greenspan.
Well, Greenspan, I think what people don't understand about the Fed is what an important role the Fed plays in this entire mess. Going back, 20, 25 years, every time Wall Street gets in a lot of trouble, the Fed has been there to bail them out. They even had a term for it on Wall Street called the Greenspan put, which essentially meant that every time the banks blew up a speculative bubble, they could go back to the Fed and borrow money at 0 or 1 or 2% and then start the game all over again. After the crash in 2008, interest rates were slashed to basically nothing. The banks could go to the Fed and get money for free, and then they're out lending it to us at 5, 6, 7. I mean, how much is your interest in your credit cards? It's 15, 20%. It's almost impossible not to make money in banking if your cost of capital is 0. That's what banking is all about, and that's what the Fed has done. It's provided a massive subsidy system for the banks on Wall Street.
You say in your article that the justice system has actually evolved into a highly effective mechanism for protecting financial criminals, not just not prosecuting them,
right,
but protecting them.
We have 2.5 million people in jail in this country, more than 1 million who are in jail for nonviolent crimes. And yet we couldn't find a single person on Wall Street to do even a day in jail for losing 40% of the world's wealth in a criminal fraud scheme. And that tells you that we have, this goes beyond, the cliche that rich people have better lawyers and they have an advantage. This is a step beyond that. This is a situation where the system is completely corrupted and it's true regulatory capture. These SEC and the Justice Department are essentially subsidiaries of Wall Street.